And then what is this thing? Gallery. Yeah, there you go. Okay. So how about we give it Zoom so people can actually come, like soonish. so why don't we just give, whatever, like 3 minutes for people to join in, and then we get started, if that's all right with you. Cool, great. This is insane, to have, like people just joining at the hour. I still, even after 2 years, I cannot get, used to this.
By the way, is the sound okay?
Yeah, so far is
I wonder if I should put my headset.
You can try if you want. So far, but we can hear you well.
Yeah,
We
maybe
can hear you well.
for the questions, I guess.
Yeah. And as I said before, this is a webinar, so the Q&A, there is a box for Q&A as well as a chat. Okay. I suggest that you don't worry. We will monitor the Q&A and the chat. We will let you know. The question, however, is: would you rather give the talk all at once and then take questions, or would you prefer to have questions during the talk? It's not that easy, so that's why it's up to you.
That's a good question. I don't know. Maybe it's better to have the questions at the end.
Okay, let's do it that way. I think it makes sense too, especially in this kind of context of webinars. It's not that easy otherwise.
Yeah.
Let's do it that way then. No problem. No problem. One more minute and then we're good to go, if that's okay with you. Yeah, great. All right, so welcome everyone to the second version of the Mindvoyage lecture series. It's our great pleasure to introduce today Romain Brette. He is a research director in computational theoretical neuroscience in the Vision Institute, where he leads the computational neuroscience of sensory system group. And his research focuses on cellular biophysics and system neuroscience, specifically on modeling auditory perception. And his work has led him to reflect on the foundational concepts of neural modeling and computational neuroscience, such as neural codes, computation, and information. He edits journals of theoretical neuroscience and a journal on paramecium neuroscience. And in 2019, he published a very influential paper in Brain and Behavioral Sciences, one of those that takes ages to write and take ages to comment on. I don't know how he survived that, but he did. Entitled "Is Coding a Relevant Metaphor for the Brain?", where he argues that the mainstream view that neural activity and coding properties of things in the world is misguided. He claims that it's more than a figure of speech. It is a model of the brain, a dualistic model in which some neurons are in the business of producing representations and some are in the business of manipulating them, as if spikes were variables, something that can be manipulated, and not activity, something that happens. He argues that the coding model of the brain is wrong in two accounts. The neural codes do not have the quality of representations, both at empirical and theoretical grounds, and neural codes have no causal powers, and therefore cannot be the basis of the model of the brain. He has a podcast in Brain Inspires that I had the pleasure to also listen to. So for those of you for whom this lecture is not enough, I seriously invite you to also go and listen to that podcast. And today, his talk is entitled "What is Information for an Organism?", where he will discuss the implication of the notion of information for neuroscientific theories, and in particular for theories of consciousness. So many thanks, Romain, for accepting our invitations, and we really look forward to your thought-provoking propositions, I'm sure. So the floor is yours, and thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. So I should share my screen again, I suppose. You need to authorize me again. I'm not, I need to be co-host, I guess, or something. Yes, okay. So, does it work?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, first of all, let me just clarify that I don't work on consciousness. So don't expect me to go into the details of the mainstream theories of consciousness. But this presentation is about a general concept that is found in theories of consciousness, but much more generally in the theories in neuroscience, in particular theories of perception and cognition. So my hope is that, at the end of this talk, well, you start with a notion that is very familiar information, like everyone uses it in neuroscience. But my hope is that at the end of this talk, you will be at least a little bit confused about what this is. So that's the goal of this talk, I guess. Okay, so let me start with a few quotes. So in integrated information theory, one of the main axioms is that consciousness is informative. So we need to clarify what is meant exactly by informative here. In another dominant theory of consciousness, the global neural workspace theory, it is claimed that a conscious process corresponds to information that enters a large-scale reverberant network. So there is apparently this thing called information that enters the brain and then moves around in the nervous system. So what is this thing? So we have this notion of information in theories of consciousness, but much more generally in theories, neuroscientific theories. For example, here's a quote from David Marr's influential book on vision. And it starts with this claim. If we're capable of knowing what is where in the world, our brains must somehow be capable of representing this information. So the word information here refers to knowing what is where in the world. What is important here in these different quotes is that they come from rather different types of theories. So for example, David Marr theory and also global neural workspace theory are, as a classical neurocomputational representationalist theories, whereas integrated information theory is claims at least to be non-representational. But all those theories are still committed to some notion of information. So is it the same notion, and what do we mean exactly by that? So by far the most popular notion of information in neuroscience is the idea of neural codes, which Lucia mentioned, and this idea is related to the notion of representation. So you can see here just a few examples. Just look at the titles of papers in mainstream journals: reading and writing the neural code, cracking the neural code, the code of consciousness, or the code for pain, and so on. So what's a code? What do we mean by a code? Well, when you look at the actual science behind the words, what you find first is a technical sense. Well, that's the sense that you find in the methods section. The technical sense is that code is a correspondence between two domains. So for example, you have the Morse code, which is a correspondence between letters and patterns of dots and dashes. And of course, this correspondence could be statistical. And we get here the notion of information in the sense of Shannon. But this technical sense is a sense from the perspective of the observer who, for example, presents the stimuli, makes some measurements, and can look at the relations between stimulus and observables. This is not the perspective of the organism itself, which is not on the side of the stimulus. But when you read the interpretations in the papers, you find a slightly different sense. So for example, this is a quote that comes from, I think it's just a representative quote from from a paper on visual neuroscience, and it says a stimulus activates the population of neurons in various areas of the brain. So here we have the technical sense, a correspondence between stimulus and some measurements of activity in the brain. But then the next sentence, to guide behavior, the brain must correctly decode this population response and extract the sensory information as reliably as possible. Now, now this is a little bit different because now the authors are talking about information, but for the organism. It is the organism that now extracts information so as to act accordingly. So the organism, it is the organism which knows that the pattern of activation indicates a particular state of affair. So that is the information in the more common sense of the word. But what is very important is that there is no logical link between these two senses. For example, if you take the bold signal, well, the bold signal certainly encodes many aspects of stimuli, at least in a technical sense. There is a correspondence between this measurement and many other things. But it's usually not said to encode stimuli, at least it's not information for the brain, even though there is this correspondence. So the two senses are different, and the technical sense does not imply the sense from the perspective of the organism. So information in the sense of a correspondence is not the same as information in the common sense. But very often we use the same words for these two senses. This is what I call semantic drift. And this is a source of much confusion in literature. So let's start by discussing what is information in the common sense. When we talk about decoding information, information that is useful for an organism and so on, what are we talking about? Well, here's an example. Information is something that can be true or false. It's, for example, there can be such things as fake news, or you can be misinformed. So in this case here, the information that you get is Donald Trump is the new president, okay? And the information here is a proposition. The information is not the value. Donald Trump is not information. What is information is Donald Trump is the new president. You need to have a proposition. So the information is relational, it relates different things, and it's propositional. It has a truth value. It's true or it's false. And that is information in a common sense. Just to emphasize this point, if you take a number, 100, could be 100 spikes, 100 hertz, or whatever you want, 100 is not information until you insert it in a context which gives meaning to that value. So 100 is not information, but my apartment is 100 square meters big, that is information. Or I am 100 years old, that is also information, but it's not the same information. The information is not the value itself, it's the complete, it's the value with its context. So in the case of neural codes, here, for example, I have a tree as a stimulus and then spike trains as responses to the stimulus. In this case, what is the information for the organism? The information is there is a tree in front of me. The information is not the spike trains. The information is there's a tree in front of me, and this is what we mean when we say that the brain decodes this information and acts accordingly so as to climb the tree. So when we say that there is information in the spike trains, why? The information in question is that X is a tree. So there's a bit of an abuse of language here because nothing in the spike trains, in their intrinsic structure, the electricity and so on, specifies the tree. Because the transformation from X to Y could be a different transformation. The information would still be the same. X is a tree. It would not be false, even though the spike trains would be different. So if you think that information is literally in the spike trains and is extracted from them, then you are led to the position or the paradox that was raised by John Eccles. So John Eccles, that you probably know, was a neurophysiologist. He got the Nobel Prize. And he wrote this: in response to sensory stimulation, I experience a private perceptual world which must be regarded neurophysiologically as an interpretation of specific events in my brain. Hence, I'm confronted by the problem: how can these diverse cerebral patterns of activity give me valid pictures of the external world? Okay, so if you think that information is in the spike trains, then how do you know that the spike trains actually refer to a tree outside in the world? If all you ever have access to are the spike trains, this seems impossible. So John Eccles, who was a very logical mind, was led to the logical conclusion of this position, which is dualism. So it considered that there must be some kind of other stuff that bridges the domain of neural activity with the domain of mental stuff, of images of the world. And this is logical, but it comes from a confusion on the notion of information, namely that information is a thing, something localized in the neurons. Um, so this initial remarks already allow us to question some conventional neuroscientific theories of perception. So for example, take the Bayesian brain and related theories. And in fact, more generally, computationalist, representationalist views. So the Bayesian brain claims that the brain represents information probabilistically by coding and computing with probability density functions. Functions of what? Functions of variables. So the idea is that the activity of neurons, and it could be a lot of neurons, is a function, a vector function, of a set of variables. And so neural activity is a representation of those variables. Now, the big problem here is what I mentioned just earlier, is that the variable, a value, is not information until it's inserted in a context which gives meaning to that value. So the problem here is that um, we have variables, but those variables quantify properties of objects, but those objects are presupposed. There must be an object with those properties. So for example, you have a variable that encodes the orientation of a bar. This presupposes that there is a bar, but maybe there are two bars. Maybe there are no bars, but something else with other properties and so on. So here we have a model. Well, rather we have variables, but we don't have the model which gives meaning to the variables. So um, So a variable is not informative in itself, only when it's included in a model and its meaning is specified. So the concept of a neural code ignores key aspects of the perceptual work, which is precisely to build objects and to build relations between objects. And just only after that can you define variables which relates to properties of those objects. And this you would see in earlier theories like Gestalt theory and so on. So how do we move on if we forget about codes as correspondences with things in the world? Well, we could say, I don't care what neural activity encodes in the world. Maybe the only thing that matters is that it varies. So imagine you have this little animal here, and there's one of its neurons which is photosensitive. So when the light is on, the state is A, and when it's off, the state is B. But of course, um, the animal doesn't have direct access to the light, so there's just this neuron that can be in state A and B, and I decide to call A light and B dark, but obviously these are arbitrary names. But nonetheless, when I observe A, I'm informed because it could have been B. Okay, this is information has differences. So if light and dark are equally likely, for example, then observing S informs me because it reduces uncertainty by 1 bit. And this is true even if you don't make any reference to light out there. This is fine, except I've been a bit fast here because it raises an issue, which is that this reduction of uncertainty is with respect to a prior state of certainty, to a prior state of knowledge. Who possesses this knowledge? This knowledge is not in the value of the state itself. So if we are talking about about information for the organism, then that knowledge should be in the perceiving agent and not out there in the world, and certainly not in the mind of the person who describing this model. So in fact, here implicitly, we are presupposing an agent with a memory and a history such that it knows that there can be two different states, and it can estimate the probabilities of the different state values. And only then can we talk about reduction of uncertainty for the organism. And if we forget about this, it's very easy to get paradoxical results because possibilities don't exist out there in the world. Possibilities are imagined by a cognitive agent. That's where they live, in a mind. So, for example, if a little animal lives all its life in a box, now I'm in a scenario where the only possible state is B. And so there would be, in this case, no reduction of uncertainty, 0 bit. The state would not be informative. But I can very well imagine another scenario where the animal, which we assume is exactly the same system, is sometimes moved out of the box randomly with maybe half of the time. So now the state can be A or B. Observing the state is now informative and reduces the uncertainty by 1 bit. But the problem is that if you compare the situation at the beginning in these two scenarios, you have exactly the same box, exactly the same systems, but in one case, you have no reduction of uncertainty. The animal is not informed. In the second scenario, the animal is informed. And the only difference is that the scenarios that I have imagined are different. Um, so this is incoherent. And the reason of the confusion is because implicitly I have attributed prior knowledge to the animal when it is actually us describing the scenario and the possible states and their probabilities, us who have this knowledge. But there's worse. You can imagine even worse than that. Imagine this scenario where the animal is in a box, and maybe at some point I will open the box, but maybe not. Maybe the animal will stay its entire life in the box. So that could be a situation where the animal stays for its entire life in the box, but because it could have been possible that the box opened at some point, it still knows that it's in the dark, it's informed. So you have scenario 1 and 3 where the organism lives all its life in the same box, but in one case it's not informed, and in the last case it is informed and it knows that it's in the dark. So this is mistaken, and the reason why is because information does not actually live in states. It is relative to the knowledge of a cognitive agent. And so the notion of information as differences actually implicitly presupposes the phenomenon it is meant to explain, namely knowledge possessed by a cognitive agent. So you can't explain cognition if you assume as a premise that there is a cognitive agent. Okay, now this issue appears actually in many contexts. For example, when you try to interpret learning in terms of the acquisition of information. So I take the example of this paper by Marcus Meister, which is an interesting paper where the author compares different tasks of learning tasks in mouse. And some tasks can be acquired very quickly in a couple of trials or even one trial by the mouse, whereas some other tasks require thousands of trials or more. And by the way, this is this fine paper. I'm not commenting it so as to trash it, but I just think that it illustrates the difficulty with the concept of information, especially this quote at the beginning. it says learning concerns the transfer of information from the environment to the animal. Now, this is very confusing because in the same sentence, we have information which is used as an objective notion, information lying there in the environment, independently of us and the animal. So that might be related to Shannon information. But then information, when it goes to the animal, is information for the animal. So it's a completely different notion now. But here's how the author quantifies this information transfer. Um, Before learning, there are many different possible mappings between states and actions. Actions could be going left and right, and states could be different states of perception in of the environment, where you are in a maze, and so on. So in this case, there are two states and two actions, so there are actually four possible mappings. Uh, and learning consists in selecting one of these four mappings. So if you have learned, you have reduced the uncertainty about the right mapping by 2 bits. So this is a way to quantify the acquisition of information. But as the author is actually careful to note in the discussion, what we are counting here is the task-specific information. But the task is in the head of the experimenter, not in the head of the mouse. There's no reason why the mouse should know what is task specific. So for example, here I've decided that the relevant action are going left and right, but maybe another action could be scratching your nose or jumping around or whatever. I made those choices because I designed the task. But there is no reason why the mouse should know that. If you enlarge the set of possible actions to everything that the mouse could actually do and all the possible perceptual states that you could imagine, like maybe feeling the heartbeat or maybe the temperature of the body of the mouse and so on, you'll have many more states, many more actions, so many more possible mappings. And so the amount of potential uncertainty reduction will be much more. So in fact, um, you cannot specify objectively the uncertainty reduction in such a learning task. This is actually done by the experiment, by the observer. And by the way, the author acknowledges this point in the conclusion, but let's go back to the first quote. The information about the task, as quantified here, had in fact never been in the environment in the first place. It was in the mind of the experimenter, for it is the observer who arbitrarily decides which states and actions are relevant to the task, so who decides on the potential uncertainty reduction. And that's the case because the uncertainty is for the observer and not for the organism. And that is always the case with Shannon information because the quantification relies on the model of the problem which identifies relevant variables, and this model lies in the head of the observer. So this is not information for the organism. Okay, now how do we get out of this mess? There are two ways out that I will discuss. One is to forget about information and focus instead of computation. So in other words, to talk about information from syntax. I'll come back to this in a little bit. The other way that I'm going to discuss now is to consider information from a completely different perspective. So let's go back to our little animal with a state that correlates with light and dark. So the animal might be much more complex than just the state, it might have eyes and so on. And this would be just one of its neurons and it's photosensitive. So the mapping here is arbitrary. We just call light a particular state, a particular state of affairs, and dark another state of affairs. It's exchangeable. But is it really? In reality, for an organism, light and dark are not at all the same. In light, you can see. In dark, you cannot see. In light, you can see, you can navigate, you can recognize stuff. So here, A is informative not because it's different from B, maybe I've never experienced B, but because it indicates particular potentialities, and you don't need to compare it with B or even to know the existence of B to know that. When we say that consciousness is informative, this is what we should mean. The information is not what it could have been, something, what it could have been, and it's not. The information is what is being presented now and the potentialities that it indicates. So you might recognize here the notion of potentialities, Gibson's notion of affordances. And indeed, this is not a new concept. A number of thinkers have made these remarks before me. So here are 4 examples. One of the oldest one is Poincaré more than a century ago, who was talking about the relativity of space. And he wrote that to localize an object only means to represent to ourselves the movement that we must make to reach an object. In the sensory motor theory of perception, vision is a mode of exploration of the world that is mediated by knowledge on the part of the perceiver of what we call sensory motor contingencies. Now, and Gibson wrote, perceiving is a registering of certain definite dimensions of invariance in the stimulus flux, what he called invariant structure. And so it should be clear here that Gibson, when he used the word information, did not mean information in the same sense as Shannon information, but or as differences or correspondences, but as relations within the sensory stream, not the same thing. And Mark Bighard finally writes, representation is constituted in pragmatic, future-oriented indications of potentialities for interaction in complex interactive agents. So all these different ideas we can summarize by using a different perspective, which is the notion of information that you have in science, information about the world that you get from observables, measurements, and from actions, which are experiments. And from that, you can build information, scientific information, for example, about the world. So an organism has a number of sensors and effectors. So we can ask, what can we know about the world with that sensory signals and actions? And this is more or less the thought experiment described by O'Regan and Noe, where you're inside a submarine and there's a villainous monster who has mixed up all the cables. And so all you can do now is to figure out how to, what happens when you move the levers, what happens on the sensors. So since you don't have access to the world, the only thing that you can hope to grasp is the laws that the sensory signals follow and their relations with actions. And by the way, that's the same thing with science. So this is what I called subjective physics. This is described in this paper here. And I'm going to describe some of its properties now with an example. But before I do, I just want to emphasize once more that this perspective does not explain cognition. On the contrary, it presupposes a cognitive agent. And that is a very important notion I want to stress, is that when we talk about information, the fact that you can describe, you, the observer, can describe relations between various things does not imply by itself any kind of sentience. You still need to have someone able to grasp or experience those relations. In other words, there is no information without cognition. So for the example now, imagine you have fictional animal, which I call a Martian iguana. Took this from Daniel Dennett, just the name. And the iguana does not see and it does not move, but it has 2 ears. And then there's this frog, which emits a sound. The frog can be at a different position. When it emits a sound, it produces sound waves that are captured at the 2 ears of the iguana. And so you get these 2 acoustical waves. And these 2 acoustical waves, they have a particular structure. what Gibson calls invariant structure. And the structure is that one of the wave is a delayed copy of the other with a delay delta. And this delay can be different depending on the position of the frog. So just by just capturing the signals, you have a relation that holds true as long as the signal is on, which is the relation that is given here. So that's a proposition, um, which is that the signal is the same on the right than on the left, a time delta before. This corresponds to what Gibson called invariant structure. So this you can capture even if you don't know that there are frogs out there. But this doesn't give you a sense of space because you have no idea about the relation between this delay and the position of the frog. You don't even know that there is such a thing as space. To have a notion of space, you need movement. So now imagine that the iguana can turn its head and it has a proprioceptive signal about the position of its head. This proprioceptive signal I call P. So now when the frog emits a sound, you can notice that if you turn the head, there's a relation between the delay in this invariant structure and the proprioceptive signal P. So in other words, you have a second order relation. So the sense of space for the iguana is now the second order relation. It is the anticipation of how the invariant structure of sounds will change with movements. But now, of course, that is still a very coarse notion of space because you don't have the Euclidean structure of space, for example. To get an Euclidean structure of space, what you would need is certain kinds of actions that form a group structure. For example, if you can make displacements. And so there's much more that could be said on this perspective, but just a few remarks for now. The first thing that need to be observed here is that information in the sense of the laws that you can grasp, it depends on possible actions of the organism. There's much more information if the animal can do certain actions than if it cannot. And it depends also on the structure of the actions, not just on whether it can do some actions. So if the actions have a group structure and so on. The second remark is that information may involve inference, but what is inferred is not the external object, but a relation, which you can see as an anticipation. If I move in such and such ways, I should observe this and that, a different invariant structure. And this has nothing to do with predictive coding. This must be stressed, because there's a confusion, or again, about the word prediction, because here, what I'm doing when I'm anticipating the invariant structure when I move my head is not prediction in the sense of predictive coding. It's not about what some other signal might be at this moment or in the next instant, but what might be if I do certain actions. And now think about it, because this is often taken as the premise of predictive coding theories. What matters for an organism is not at all to predict what's next, because what matters is to predict what might be next, depending on on the actions that I can do, so that I can select the right actions. Otherwise, if I can't select the right actions, then this information is not very useful. So it's not predicting that is important, it's anticipating conditionally to the actions. Okay, the third remark I want to make is that inference is necessarily and logically secondary to the pickup of these relations. And this is, by the way, a remark that Gibson made, but that people like David Marr, for example, seem to have missed. This goes against the standard notion of information or perception as inference, because there's this commonplace idea that since we access the world only indirectly through our senses, we have to infer the world. But that is totally incoherent, because if you can never ever access the outside world, there's no way you can ever infer what it is. It's actually meaningless to say that we infer what it is if it's a domain outside um, ourselves. It's not an external description of the world that you infer, but some relational description of the subjective physics once you have established it. So logically, inference is secondary to the capture of the relations. And of course, it relies on memory and some cognitive abilities. Okay, now, I mentioned that there's a completely different way to deal with the problem of information. That's the way offered by computationalism, neurocomputationalism. And it gives a completely different view on the issue. So we can take again the iguana, but imagine now that the iguana is just running an algorithm which estimates the position of the frog. So it runs an algorithm which goes like this. You have the acoustic signal at both ears. Then you calculate a cross-correlogram, and you find the peak. And the time lag at the peak is delta. Delta is it's called the interval time difference. And then you transform delta into the angle by using a formula. And maybe you map this angle to a number of steps that the motor could do to face the frog or something else. So you have a series of operations like this, and you don't need so much to care about information as long as you have a variable in your algorithm which, when you execute it, is related to the position of the frog in the world. And this is what is typically called information processing. Now, just before, I claimed that it's impossible for the iguana to have any idea of the position of the frog unless it can move. But now it seems that just by having a variable in this computational iguana that is in correspondence with, through the flow of the algorithm with the position of the frog, it seems that um, this variable has information about the position of the frog. So what's wrong? What's wrong is that the computational iguana here cannot possibly be said to have information about the position, because it has no way to know whether that information is right or wrong. I called it theta, but it is me who gives the name theta, which I know is supposed to be an angle of the frog, but what there is just a value in this algorithm, and the iguana, the computational iguana, has no way to know whether that output is correct or not. So it's not information in the usual sense of the word. It cannot be true or false. And a consequence of this, or a way to see that the iguana doesn't have this information, is that if there is a drift in the components, a degradation in the function, um, such that the formula is different, well, the algorithm will still run in the same way, and there is nothing in the algorithm which raises the error, because a code is never in error. A code is just a transformation from an input to an output. There is no normativity in a code. So it makes no difference for the iguana whether the output of the calculation is the angle or twice the angle. And of course, for a biological organism, this is an issue because the components are constantly changing. So when we talk about information processing, it should be clear that we are actually talking about information for the observer, because at no point is there information for the organism, actually. But we knew this all along, in fact, because if we frame what the system does as information processing, then what we are saying is that there was information at the beginning in the input, and then whatever the system does only degrades that information. This is a theorem that is called the data processing inequality. Shannon information can only decrease. So this cannot possibly describe what we mean when we say that consciousness or perception is informative. And clearly we're mistaken if we think that information processing describes the process of an organism getting informed, for that is logically incoherent with the idea that information is degraded by the processing. Clearly, we're not using the word for the same meaning. There's a common mistake objection, which is to invoke evolution as a source of information, in particular in the context of computationalism. So, for example, the mechanism, which is the algorithm here, is what it is because it has been selected by evolution. So, for example, if the mechanism is wrong, then the iguana cannot eat the frog, and so it dies. So, in a way, the algorithm incorporates information about the world. But again, that's not information for the iguana. And it's mistaken, it's confused to think that the feedback that you get here when you're wrong gives you information, because the feedback that you get when you're wrong in this case is that you're dead, and you can't know that you're wrong when you're dead. So there is no information in this case. Evolution is a source of change, maybe a source of adaptation, but it's not a source of information, at least not for the organism. Now, I'm going to address a more subtle but also a more fundamental issue that is really at the core of the neurocomputational view. So let's go back to this quote by David Marr. If we are capable of knowing what is where in the world, then our brains must somehow be capable of representing this information. Now, of course, somehow is a little bit vague. So what did David Marr say? Uh, well, first of all, I I want to note that it is in fact completely possible that the iguana turns its head towards the frog without involving any kind of representation. And there's a very simple non-representational algorithm, which is the following. You turn your head towards the louder ear, and then you stop when the intensities match. And so here you have a way to face the source of the sound, which involves feedback, but no representation per se, no representation of the position anyway. But this is not what Marr meant, and what representationalists, classical representationalists, mean in general. And what they mean in general is that there are cases such as the following, where the frog emits a short sound, and then the sound is off, and the iguana turns its head towards the frog. And there's no feedback here during that movement. So the iguana behaves appropriately in the absence of the stimulus. It cannot use feedback. This is what is called in the literature representation-hungry behavior. From this point, you can make the following reasoning. At a given instant, when the sound is over, the future behavior of the iguana is a function of the frog's angle. So if we think that the behavior is determined by the state of the brain at that moment, then that implies that it should be possible to map the state of the brain to the angle theta. In other words, the brain must somehow encode theta, the position of the frog. And another way to say it is that there is information in the brain state about theta. And implicit in this idea is the fact that the system, which is constituted by the brain and body, maybe environment, is a deterministic or a Markov process whose behavior depends only on its current state. So this process leads the brain into a new state and a new head position that is such that it faces the frog. So in this sense, it is actually mathematically true that one can decode the brain state into the frog's angle. That mapping is precisely the integration of the processes of the organism. So here's the reasoning that leads to a computational representationalist view. You have representation of theta in the brain state, and then computation in the form of brain processes. Okay, there are a number of issues here, but the one I'd like to draw your attention on is precisely what neuroscientists usually do when they look for neural representations or codes. And what is done generally is that they look at a neuron or group of neurons and measure their activity during a certain temporal window after presenting the stimulus. You have measurement of activity. Two problems here. The first is that the reasoning that we have made does not imply at all that any particular neuron or group of neurons encodes any given variable. It simply implies that the state of the entire organism and body encodes that variable as well as all other possible behavioral variables. So in actuality, the claim that we have made just before, which was very logical, was in fact very broad. But that's not the biggest issue here. The biggest issue is that what we measure here is not a state at all. Not a state in the sense of physics, not a state in the sense of Markov processes. It's not the membrane potential of a neuron here. What we measure here is the activity of the system events over an extended period of time linked to the stimulus. That is not a state in the sense of a dynamical system, something that constrains its future behavior. So it is not true that the activity of the system now, the brain processes is what changes one code into another code, because what we call code is actually not a state, but is something that is abstracted from activity. So in fact, there is a confusion here between observable measurement of activity, for example, and state. A measurement of activity is not a state. So the reasoning here is actually incorrect. Any theory that looks for information in patterns of neural activity and try to use that in the context of a computational theory is actually confusing states and processes, mixing them up. And this brings me to consciousness, in particular, the content of consciousness. So there's again a confusion on the words, and the word is state. When we say that we're in a certain mental state, we believe that, well, there must be a relation between the state of the brain at this moment and our mental state, in other words, a code. The problem here is that we use state in very different meanings. And we can see why with this thought experiment, um, which comes from the TV series Bewitched. So in this TV series, one of the main character is Samantha, and she's a housewife, and she's actually a witch. But so when there's something that she needs to fix, she twitches her nose, and then everyone freezes. And then she does whatever she needs to do, fixes problems and so on, twitches her nose again, and everyone unfreezes and lives their life as if nothing happened in between. Now, if you think that there is a mapping between the brain state and the mental state, what people are actually experiencing, then you should think that during the whole time between the two nose twitches, when people were frozen, they have the same brain state, and so they have been experiencing the same thing all along. But that is not at all what happened in the TV series. What happened is that they had experienced nothing at all. Time had just jumped from one time to another. So if we believe in TV series, then our idea of a mental state is actually wrong, because a mental state should actually refer to some activity and not to state in the sense of physics. So, and in fact, when we talk about mental state, we often refer to moods and things like that, which have nothing to do with pressure and volume and so on. So why is there so much confusion on this notion of information? Well, some of it comes from language. And so linguists have pointed out for a long time that language shapes our thought. So in this paper that I cite here, I cited before, Farid Zanoun argues that the idea of talking about the related notion of representation as if there were actual things in the brain, so reification, is a category error that comes from a grammatical category of the word representation, which is a noun. So there's a linguistic phenomenon which I didn't know, which is called hypostatization, which is using the grammatical category of nouns for something that is not substantive, like an action or a property. So, for example, when you say going for a walk, okay, walk is actually an activity. So when we say that there is information in a book, that is not literally a thing physically in the book that is information by itself. I mean, surely there are letters, but it's not the ink that holds the information or the shape of the letters. What happens rather is that you get informed by reading the book, and this involves obviously the letters in the book, but also linguistic conventions to associate letters to the meaning. And of course, you, a cognitive agent that happens to know those conventions. So that's um, so what we actually have here is a process by which someone gets informed, and the process involves letters which play a mediating role in the process, but they don't hold anything in themselves. The idea that there is information out there in the world is confused. The question of where is information in the brain comes from this linguistic confusion, when the relevant question should rather be, how does an organism inform itself? And when you phrase it in this way, it's different. You now have an activity that is done by the organism, and information does not precede that activity. So we've seen that the idea of information as correspondence with something else is based on a confusion between the perspective of the observer and the perspective of the organism. And the same is true for information as differences. The confusion raises from the reification of the concept of information, treating it as if it were a thing localized somewhere. And what we've seen is that information, in the common sense of the word, is something that is relational, propositional, can be true or false, and necessarily involves an agent, a cognitive agent. Uh, so let's go back now to three quotes of the beginning, and I'll start with David Moore. If we are capable of knowing what is where in the world, our brains must somehow be capable of representing this information. Somehow. What did he mean here by somehow? Either he just meant that representing this information is just knowing what's where in the world, but then that is just a tautological statement. And I suppose Moore didn't want to make just a tautological statement and actually meant something. So the other possibility is that it meant that there is actually something in the brain, a representation that is holding the information in itself, and that is false. At least it's not implied by the premises that we are capable of knowing what's where in the world. So uh, now let's have a look at this quote from Global Neural Workspace Theory. A conscious process corresponds to information that enters a large-scale reverberant network. Now, this seems very confused now. There's information in the brain that exists uh, before the brain does anything, and it enters the brain, and then it can move around in the network, sort of riding on neural activity. Now, of course, this odd statement only makes sense if you consider the notion of information as correlate or something in the world. But that has nothing to do with information in the common sense, as in the organism informs itself, in which information is the result and not the premises of the organism's activity. And finally, in integrated information theory, so there's this axiom that consciousness is informative, but what is meant by that is clarified by this example. An experience of pure darkness is what it is by differing in its particular way from an immense number of possible experiences, so information as differences. But a stimulus cannot be informative for the organism by contrast with possible stimuli imagined by someone else. If the set of possible stimuli, for example, is somehow constrained without the organism knowing about it, there's no reason why the experience of the organism should change. For another experience to influence the present experience, that experience must be somehow already present in the system as memory, for example. pure darkness is not what it is because it's different from other images. Pure darkness is the experience of not being able to see. When you move your eyes, the experience doesn't change, and so on. That is what pure darkness is. So I've dismissed conventional notions of information used in the field, but of course what I propose seems to be a little bit vague, something relational, propositional that involves an agent. And of course it's vague. I started my talk by telling you that I hope that at the end you'll be a little bit confused about what information is. And why? Because we start by asking how an organism processes information. So information is taken as a premise, something that's already out there. And this is confused because information for an organism cannot pre-exist to its perceptual processes. The notion of an organism, in fact of an agent, logically precedes the notion of information. So a better formulation would be, how does an organism inform itself? So if you phrase it more appropriately in this way, it's clear that information is actually what needs to be explained, and it cannot be the starting point of explanations. And this obviously applies to theories of consciousness. Thank you. You here?
Yeah. Thank you, Roman. This was, it was a lot that you tried to put in there. So I think that Tanya was going.
Hear you better.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Just let me. Can you speak? Yeah.
I can still hear you well.
Okay.
Can you hear me well? Because
Yeah,
I know that somebody was saying that my mic was not very.
I think it was just a one-off, Lucia, because I asked around some other participants. Everybody was able to hear everything other than that one person that reported it. So I think we're good.
Okay.
So yes, we do have one question so far in the chat, which I will pass on to Romain. So if you have any other questions, please add them to the Q&A and we'll get to them the best that we can. So the first question is, I struggle to understand why anticipation in your suggestion is not prediction in a predictive coding sense. Are you suggesting that anticipation is for action planning, an inverse model in movement neuroscience, while prediction is about the consequence of an executed movement based on a forward model? And that was from Quan Chu.
Okay, so first of all, I want to clarify. I remove this so I can hear myself. I want to clarify that I'm saying that anticipation in the way I described is not prediction in the way that predictive coding speaks of prediction, but that's because predictive coding speaks about prediction in a very narrow sense. That is to say that a prediction in predictive coding is simply that there's a correspondence between one signal and another signal, okay, at either the same time or at the next instant. That's prediction in predictive coding. But that's not prediction in the common sense of the word, and that's certainly not anticipation. So anticipation, one sense of anticipation, and it's not the only one, is what I described before, is to infer what might, and not what is, what might happen if I do certain actions. Okay, so it's the, for example, if I move my head in this direction, the sound will change in this way, but if I move it in the other direction, it will change in this way. And this is because it is conditional that you can actually use this information because you can select the action so as to do whatever you want to do. Now, there's also another sense of anticipation, which has nothing to do with knowing the signals, but with preparing yourself. And this you have in cognition, but also more generally in biology. For example, I'm not sure I can mimic here, but you can see what happens in athletics when people are running 100 meters and they start. And before they start, they put themselves in this position, okay? I don't know if you can see it. That is anticipation, okay? They put yourself in a certain position so that when the trigger is on, they will immediately run with maximum force. They anticipate the start of the course that does not involve predicting a signal in a sense of predictive coding either. The notion of anticipation is much broader than the notion of prediction in predictive coding, which is, well, as narrow as coding, basically. Is it okay?
There's another question here, and this is from Castor. I'm gonna not say the name right. Lucia, you can probably correct me on this one. So it says, I feel a bit confused, but could you elaborate on how we would fare with the concept of information if we consider that there is a teacher? A teacher could say, this is a tree, you are in a box, there is a frog over there, etc.
Sorry, with an actual person instructing yourself, right? Or that's not at all the same thing as information in the context of experience, right? We're talking about linguistic concepts now. So in if I come back to the example where you have an actual tree and then the visual neural activity that is in response to that tree, then what I argue is that in the spike trains themselves, there is no information because the information is that it is a tree. And so if you have an instructor, what this means is that you have actually another source of signal and you're associating these two different things. So again, this information is that those spike trains are in relation with whatever the instructor has said. So again, the information is in the relation between the spike trains and some other signals. So it's relational and propositional. So it's again, not in the spike trains, it's in the relation. So it's not really different, in fact.
And I've added Casper into the talk in the case that he wants to say anything further towards this question. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next one.
Yeah, I think you answered my question. Thanks. I was thinking about how you get a representation, right? It's clear that you would have two different patterns and you would associate them. But sort of in an abstract concept, the teacher would give you sort of a way to attach the sort of representation to your pattern of activity. But it doesn't really solve the problem. So. Thanks.
Okay, so that's all that's in the Q&A at the moment. There was something else in the, there's another one. So from Johannes Kasper, you differentiate it between environment and in the head of the experimenter or observer, but why is this head not part of the agent's environment?
So I did that. I think you're referring to the, not sure which part you're referring to, maybe the case of learning, learning as in gaining information, the acquisition of information, maybe.
If Johannes wants to clarify, I'll just.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. When you said that actually that those possibilities only exist in the head of the experimenter and not in the environment, like those action possibilities.
Right. So I was referring to a description of the task, but who describes the task? It's not the environment. It's the experimenter who describes the task. The task is the rat has to go left and right and so on. So this description is in the head of the experimenter who describes the task, because the experiment itself could be described in a very different way. For example, the animal could scratch its nose, the animal could jump around, the animal could feel its temperature or the weather, and so on. There could be another description. But when you're talking about descriptions, these descriptions are made by someone. And that someone, in this case, is not the organism.
Yeah, that's true. But then it becomes part of the environment by the actions of the experimenter, right? I mean, because he's putting some constraints on the environment and somehow interacting with the.
But that's not exactly true, because the mouse can still scratch her nose. It's not. It's just that it's not taking into account in the model of the task. And there is still a weather, there is still a temperature and humidity and so on. It's still out there. It's just that it's not considered as relevant, but relevance is for someone. So.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Now I understood what you mean. You mean like to define the information. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Question is from Isaac David, saying, thanks for the talk. I'm intrigued by this an activist notion that darkness is what it is because it stands in some relation to an action that allows one to see something else. However, it seems the same property is true for any persistent visual experience. Pure redness example, how would you distinguish between those?
Okay, yeah. So this, I think, is treated by other people probably better than me. I'd say like neo-Gibsonians maybe. Like you have that in the book of Alva Noe, or the one of Kevin Oregon. So in the case of red, actually, there's a very interesting paper by Kevin Oregon and David Filippona about pure colors. And they wouldn't admit it, but it's actually a Gibsonian view on pure color. And the idea is that when you turn a surface, or when you change, when the sun moves and so on, what arrives to your eyes is, well, the light of the sun that has been absorbed by the surface and then reflected. So there is some variation of this spectrum when you move the surface, and it turns out that for a certain number of surfaces, this variation is not three-dimensional as it should be, because spectrum of the sun is more or less three-dimensional. I mean, of the sun, of the ambient light. I mean, it turns out for certain kinds of surfaces, it's one or two-dimensional, and those are the pure colors. So there is actually an explanation of pure colors in terms of invariant structure that you can find in the literature. So if you, so I give you another example, which is maybe a little more obvious. What is a straight line? So if you take the perspective of pattern recognition, a straight line is a certain pattern that is a pattern of pixels. And there are a number of different patterns with different angles which correspond to straight lines. You match them to your image, and if they match, that's a straight line. Now, in the sensory motor view, a straight line is not that at all. A straight line is something that when you follow it with your eyes, that doesn't change. That is a straight line. That's the description which is much more geometrical and in my view, much more satisfying, because there is nothing specific about a pattern, the pattern view, it could be another kind of pattern, but there's something very special about straight lines. And it is special because of geometry, basically. And you can only see this if you can move your eyes, or if you can move, and you can define straight lines in this way. Does that clarify?
Before we get to Larissa, hopefully, let me ask you a couple of questions, actually, because I find that you make a very good case for how we conflate the notion of information for the organism, what it exists for me, versus what it exists for the experimenter, right? Like the third-person perspective versus the first-person perspective, right? And I think that you also made a very good case for how we as experimenters, we think that what matters for that organism is only the variables that we control and we care, but in fact, it could be anything else. And so that seems to be like a categorical mistake, and it's very clear, that is problematic. Even trying to then on top of that map those states that are in our heads to the states in the brain of somebody else, right? Now, what what I did not hear was what then you think it exists for an organism.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
What do you think it exists then for an organism, right? So it's clear what, like say if I present you with red, like then I try to infer that what it exists for you would be something like red. But as you pointed out, it could be something completely different, right? So how do we go about try to understand what it exists in my own Umwelt, so to speak, right? Not in the one that I'm trying to impose on you as an experimenter, but on the one that actually exists for myself, right? Because ultimately that is the science that they understood you are trying to postulate that we actually have to do. So it's not about what I think it exists for you, but what actually really truly exists for you as an organism. What is information for the organism and not, like for the experimenter, right?
Okay, yeah. So for me, part of the answer, and I say only part of the answer because I aware that it's not a complete explanation, but part of the answer is to look at what I call the subjective physics. That is not correspondences with an objective description of the world, but simply whatever relations exist between sensory signals and between sensory signals and actions and so on. And these are things that you can describe objectively. So it doesn't mean that the organism has this information necessarily, but it's certainly a constraint on the kind of information that it can have and the structure of this information, because I don't think information is a number. So, but as I mentioned, I tried to emphasize several times, when you realize that information is not a thing, but is in fact rather the outcome of an activity, the activity of the organism informing itself, then it becomes clear that understanding information is the same thing or needs to be understood jointly with understanding cognition. You cannot understand them separately. And I think that is the mistake that is made by many theories in neuroscience, to start with information and then build cognition on top of that. And this, I think, is a confusion, because information should be the outcome of the cognitive activity of the organism. So, yeah, I'm not sure what your question exactly is. Maybe it's more pragmatic than that. Yeah.
What I was trying to grab my head around is that what I seem to have heard is that the way in which information exists for the organism is in relationship to his or her own actions, right? And so it's because you're positing this idea of sensory motor, like loops in some sense, right? Which I think that it has many advantages, but then in some way.
Yeah, and not only in what I described. So here, what you described it is the sensory motor theory of perception, but I don't think that's complete. In what I described, there's also the Gibsonian notion of invariant structure, which does not involve action necessarily. It could, but not necessarily. For example, actually in the fictional case of the Martian iguana, there's an invariant structure in the sounds due to the fact that there's a single sound projected on 2 ears. And so that results in some structure in the signals. This does not necessarily require actions to see that structure. So it's not only the actions, I would say.
I see your point. What I was trying to grab my head around is that it seemed to me that, correct. So one source of information would be for the kind of actions that I can perform, and the other, the set of constraints that the environment imposes on myself, right? That's kind of like the Gibsonian, the other part of the Gibsonian equation, right? But then in some sense, what exists for the organism is either something that reflects the laws of how my body constrains those experiences, or the things that I do, right? So would you then say that there's nothing like the state of being? So imagine that, like if I cannot move, or I don't have a body, so to speak, and a particular set of stimuli that sets me up in a particular way, then I will not have any experience.
Sorry, say again. If I don't have a body, no.
If I don't move,
If I don't
right?
move,
So therefore I cannot have like the sensory motor aspect, right? And understand the sense of potentialities through my actions, right? And at the same time, I am not being impacted by the external world with the set of constraints that it imposes on myself. Then this means that I could not experience, because it's only through these two aspects that I get experience.
So I want to clarify that what I describe, subjective physics, is not at all description of experience.
Mm-hmm.
It's a description of a notion of information.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
But it's not a description of experience. In fact, I don't need to describe these relations, I don't actually need to have a cognitive agent or a person in there, right? So that's, I think, kind of a different question, because what you can say is that if you could not do any action on the world and not have any signals from the world, then you could not know anything about the world. That is what we can say with this.
Okay.
But then
fair enough.
A different question is, the notion of experience. Then, it's a bit
I was
more
trying to get to the point of existence for the organism, right? Because I think that this is, this is what I want to point out. That I don't know if Larry is still here, but because this is what I think IIT is after, right? So what is existence for the organism?
Yeah, but that is very problematic because for this you need to explain what is an organism. And so far I haven't. I've just talked about information, but not about organism, agency, and therefore experience. And it is also maybe one of the points I try to make is that as long as you only talk about information in the sense of relations or things that you can describe, you cannot infer that there is an experience coming on top of that. I mean, it's an extra thing to be explained. That's what I try to emphasize several times, is that you still need to have someone to make sense of those relations and so on.
Correct.
And that's why you cannot start with information and assume that because there's information, then you feel. That is not logically
Absolutely
correct.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
I don't really know how to answer this question, in fact, but that's also kind of what I meant in my last slide, is that information should not be the premises of the research. Basically, it should be part of the research. I mean, we have this idea that information is a familiar notion, and so on. And we are so accustomed to the idea of, the concepts of Shannon information and information as correspondence and so on, that we just forget that it's just one formalization of some parts of the concept of information. And even Shannon himself wrote explicitly that it was a communication theory, which was only about the syntactic aspect and not about meaning. And it's very explicit about that. It's not a complete formalization of the notion of information, which is very complicated, in fact. And why is it complicated? Because it has to involve cognition. So if you don't know what cognition is, it's actually quite difficult to explain information in a very satisfying way, or complete way.
Fully agree. Larissa, do you want to go next? I think I hear that you have to leave. Do you want to bring her up, Daniel?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
okay.
Really well.
First, I wanted to say that I absolutely loved your presentation, right? And I always do, up until the part where it comes to IIT, usually, which here was just a minute. So I just want to take the invitation by Lucia to say a few things, and that is that we're just, I think, I mean, the reason that it's almost always a bit disappointing to me, this misunderstanding of IIT, and I mean, we had this exchange on your blog also, you know, because I really feel that there is a misunderstanding, because we're very, very much trying to heed all your warnings about information, right? And then there is this, so the part that you cited, right, that information is experience is informative. It is what it is. So that's the first part about it. And what that means is just that, and so it can't be taken just by itself, right? Before that, we have the composition postulate that says that experience is composed of all these parts. And if you put that together with the information, what it says is basically that your experience is made up, or it is what it is because of its contents, right? And then a conjecture of that, not something you infer directly from the experience, but a conjecture is that you could have other experiences if the components of your experience were differently arranged, more or less, right? And then when we move to organisms, conscious organisms, and ask about the implementation of, or what corresponds, what accounts for such experiences within the brains of the organisms, what we need is some mechanism, something, right, that can, I think, so this light and dark example you had was really great for making that point, right? So let's say we have an organism and it never ever sees dark, right? And there's nothing in its brain that would react to light if it were shown light, right? So this organism cannot possibly see light, but it also really cannot know what it means to be dark, right? So it neither has the experience of dark, nor does it have the experience of light. On the other hand, you could imagine that there is an organism that evolved to seeing light and dark, but because it's in captivity or for some reason, it's always held in a dark box, right? So that organism, if it is shown light, there will be something in its brain that responds to the light and makes a difference to the rest of the brain. And because of that, it has the capacity to experience light. And even though it never does, that capacity to experience light gives it a capacity to experience dark, right? So that's where this difference that makes a difference comes to. And maybe just the last comment on what Lucia was saying about the what is an organism and sensory signals and actions, right? So sensory signals and action only work if you have a presupposed organism, right? And what IIT is trying to do is to say, okay, so for the brain, so sensory neurons in our visual cortex, for example, receive a lot of recurrent back connections from other parts of cortex. So what makes them sensory neurons in the first place? What makes the neurons in sensory cortex different from neurons in like higher level areas? And in the end, if you really think about what could be, you know, mechanism, so something that takes this and causes that within the brain, right? You can't even really talk about sensory signals and actions because you already put the borders around the system, but you could put narrower borders, and now the sensory signal to, I don't know, the parietal cortex might be some motor vision area, right? and the action signal of parietal cortex might be frontal eye field neurons or something, right? So it everything influences everything. And I loved your point that you cannot just take information by itself. And you said that you want to put it together with cognition. And I think what IIT is doing is it's very close, but it doesn't put it together with like cognition, but with like the causal model of the brain. So there's no such thing as abstract information, right? So it's information that's instantiated as causal differences. And the causal part is really crucial. Yes, that's it. That's what I'm going to say.
Okay, so I can comment on one part which corresponds to, I guess, my slide with the boxes and so on, where I suppose that according to you, I'm according to IIT, I don't know, as I said, I don't work on consciousness, okay? So I only comment, in fact, on this axiom, which I think is problematic, which is information has differences, okay? No, so I suppose that for IIT, if I understood correctly, in fact, the little animal which stays in the box all its life actually does experience dark. Is that correct? Your mic is not on, so I don't know if you're responding.
Sorry, there's things going on around me. If you could repeat the last sentence.
Right. So would you say that according to IIT, the animal in the box, even if it stays in the box all its life, it still experiences dark. Is that correct?
If it has the capacity to also experience light. Yes.
Exactly. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so that's the problem for me, because you need to define what capacity means. What does it mean, or possibility? What does it mean that, so the state could be A or B? That's what you're saying, because of evolution and so on, it has evolved. Well, it has evolved, but maybe, you know, there's a genetic default or maybe whatever. The thing is, it is you who defined what a possibility is. A possibility by definition does not exist. So for me, an animal in a box cannot actually experience light. In fact, maybe it has a photoreceptor, but is the same thing as a deficient photoreceptor. It will never get activated. The system is exactly the same, and the box is exactly the same. It is
but that can be tested, right? I mean, you could have the, so what I mean is, if it's
I'm not talking about empirical stuff here, just about logics, okay? Just saying that you have exactly the same system, but just because you say that it could.
But I could make a model of its brain, right? I could make a model of its brain. I could run the computer simulation, right? Like a physical model where I have every neuron I have as a computer model. The animal stays in the box, it never experiences light, right?
Wait,
so at least we can.
How about this?
Yeah.
Hear my objection. How about this? Here's what I could do too. I take an animal which is actually not sensitive to light, but it's something sensitive to something else. Let's say to touch. But then I could do this. I could have a device which turns light into touch. And so now that animal could have a neuron that is actually sensitive to light. But I don't do it. It's just a possibility. It's just a possibility that I can imagine. So in theory, I can model it, I can simulate it. It could be that this animal is sensitive to light. Does that mean that it can see?
No, because
you make an arbitrary distinction then.
No, because you have to look at the physical system that's in the box, right? You have to look at what the organism is, what its neural network is, and how its neural network is connected. And without that, there is no information in the first place. That's what I tried to say with, or I liked it that you said that there is no information in itself, right? So I can't talk about information without knowing the physical causal structure of the organism's brain.
But now, you're talking about a relation with light, not just about the nervous system. You're talking about the outside world, right? So
but the outside world is completely meaningless without.
No, it's not if you say that the sensor is actually sensitive to light. It's not meaningless anymore. That's actually the core of your session.
But the sensor in itself isn't saying light, right? I think we agree on that.
But what you're saying is that the sensor is sensitive to light, and even though there is no light and there can never be light, because it's sensitive to light, the animal can know
Well,
that it's dark.
Maybe we
But-
can at least agree on a necessary condition for it to see light, right? A necessary condition for it to see light is that it has some kind of sensor that then does something to its brain physically, right? And if it doesn't, so if there's no physical change in the brain because of the light, right?
But
it could
of
not
course,
possibly.
of course, there are necessary conditions. That's not really the
Yeah.
question. The question
it's
is
just
whether there's
turning that
experience or
around.
not.
So if it doesn't have the necessary conditions to experience light, I'm saying it also doesn't have the necessary conditions to experience dark.
But we're fine so far. What our disagreement is that you say that if there is the possibility, something to be explained, the possibility for the sensor to be sensitive to light, then even though there is no light and there will never be.
But it's never the sensor in itself. I think that's the big point, right? It's always the sensor embedded in a complex network where the sensor has to make a difference to the network. The network has to be able to make a difference to the sensor and so on.
Still, to make the claim that the animal can sense dark, you still need to make an assumption which relates the animal with the outside world, namely light.
We never.
Yes, you do.
Actually,
you say there is a possibility that it then captures light. So you are talking about light here.
It's completely intrinsic anyways, right? So it never refers to the outside world.
Okay, I don't know about the formalism, but the axiom as it is stated, especially about what a dark experience is not what you say. It does talk about the outside world, specifically about the different kinds of images that could be in the world and so on. So it's not.
Yeah, but not in the world. No. It talks about different experiences. That doesn't even. I mean, we have to convey the message somehow. That's why we refer to visual experiences. But it's not about perceiving different things in the world. It's about having different experiences, which isn't really about the world in the first place.
Then it seems to become a bit circular, no?
Well, let me see where this metaphor will try to like explain to or clarify what Larissa's point is.
Maybe I should say that I have to go in 1 or 2 minutes, unfortunately.
Actually, I have to go too. So.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to give Lucia the last word on this, and thanks you so much. And I hope we can get together at some point and talk this out further. Yes. So I will say goodbye now, but I hope you still listen to what you have to say, Lucia. Bye-bye.
No. I didn't mean to, like steal your, I think that you guys had the proper exchange. I was just trying to, get to the point that I think that for IIT, Larissa was trying to explain the things through a sensor, but in principle, you can think of a system that is just completely detached from anything. And if I understand correctly, what IIT would try to do is, if you understand what the causal changes or the causal change within the system, that's enough. So you don't have to experience anything in the world in and of itself, or be embedded or be touched by a sensor, is what the causal physical structure, can do. And those potentials can actually be quantified within the system, even if you actually don't have it connected or having an action.
Your point. Yeah, I understand your point, and that's what Larissa said, but that's not what the axiom says. The axiom talks about a coupling between the world and the organisms, so that consciousness is informative. Yeah. And it's explicit in the example. I mean, maybe the example is wrong and they should write it differently.
Yeah.
Okay.
Perhaps,
but as it is for me incoherent to say that you experience dark because dark could be something else. That for me doesn't work.
So the perhaps the examples are not particularly illuminating, but their points, as far as I understand them, is like it's completely intrinsic. It's not necessarily so in a sense, like.
But that's
disconnected.
It's intrinsic, but still the organism can have a visual experience, so it's not completely intrinsic.
Correct.
There is still a coupling, which changes the states and so on, depending on stuff in the environment. So it's not completely intrinsic, in fact.
Correct. So no. So it is intrinsic, but it can have a sensor. It's
right. So it's not intrinsic, right? It's
the
not
way
what
we
is
should
not.
think
So
about it
let,
is
let me maybe clarify one thing. What is not intrinsic, because I see in the formalism it's just about the states, but what is not intrinsic is the probabilities and the changes in states, because those changes can be triggered by light and so on. That's where the non-intrinsic stuff occurs in the formalism, is that the state changes, for example, of the sensor depends on light. So yes, it's all about what a state says.
Not necessarily, Roman. So that's exactly why. So when
Well,
you
in the
dream,
examples that
for
they,
instance,
not necessarily, I agree. But
so that's what I mean. Like when you dream.
Okay, but still, all the examples that they give in the paper I was mentioning is where you have this paper with the diode, for example. I assume that they believe in it, or maybe all of this is wrong and it's only about dreams. I don't know, but that's not what I feel from reading the papers. And so there is actually a coupling with the environment, but which is hidden in the probabilities, the transition probabilities. So that's where it's kind of hidden there. But the problem here is that there lie actually assumptions, which are models made by the observer, or the scenarios with the boxes and so on. They are there in the probabilities of transitions, but you don't see them because it's all about what a state, the state of the organism tells you about the past and future states of the organism. So it feels that it's intrinsic, but it's not, because the transitions are not depend on the coupling. Actually, it's just not explicitly in the formalism, but it's there. And anyway, I was just commenting on the axiom, which tries to clarify what information is supposed to mean in this theory. And for me, it's a problem because it's a confusion of the notion of information. So if it's an axiom that is meant to bridge the formalism with the common sense notion of information that we have when we talk about consciousness, then there's a problem here because it's not the same notion that we use.
And I think I understand you're bringing a good point. And in the interest of time, because I don't want we have already, like stretched your time, and this has been already super illuminating. And I hope that, like it was clear to the audience, like the really deep points that you're trying to make for us when we do neuroscience and what information means, and what are we actually even after, So I hope that, like that was completely, like clear, and people take it. Because it's a really deep, it's a really deep point. And I think unfortunately we're gonna have to, cut it. And I know there's a bunch of questions from the audience, and I think we have to apologize. But I think that Roman, we need to leave Roman. He needs to leave. So I'm really sorry.
My kids, so
yeah, I know,
sorry.
I know. And I want to leave the last word to Tanya.
Okay, well, I just wanted to thank Romain for this very thought-provoking talk. It was very animated and informative, which is exactly what these Mindvoyage talks aim to do. So thank you very much, Romain, and to all the attendees that joined us today. We have another Mindvoyage scheduled for July, actually just in a couple of weeks, and we're just sorting out some of the details, but currently it's definitely going to be an in-person event at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics in Frankfurt. And we're looking to make that a hybrid event. So please stay tuned for announcements on what the details of that one. So that's it for today. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.